This video is the Chapter 16 Microbial Life Notes. This chapter is predominantly about bacteria. We'll continue to study bacteria really throughout the year because they're a great model organism. They're small, they're cheap, they're easy to grow, so we use them to represent in a lot of the labs that we do. So taking a look at these first initial pictures, micro means small, of course. So we are talking about extremely small organisms, meaning small compared to your cells. The picture on the left represents a pin head, so it's the tip of a pin, and then you can see how small the teeny tiny bacteria cells are that are growing on it. The picture on the right represents a human cell, so this is a eukaryotic cell with the nucleus in the middle, and you can see just based on the size comparison how teeny tiny the bacteria cells are compared to the human cell. Two definitions that we'll use and see throughout the year. A prokaryote is an organism that does not have a nucleus. Karyote is like a Latin term for nucleus, and pro means before. So it's believed that prokaryotes evolved before eukaryotes, and prokaryotes are organisms that are single-celled. Yeah, they don't have a nucleus, but also they don't have any other organelles, like mitochondria, chloroplast, smooth ER, rough ER, things like that. A eukaryote is an organism that does have a nucleus and it does have organelles. Eukaryotes are sometimes free living, like some algae and other microorganisms are eukaryotes, but also all multicellular organisms are made of eukaryotic cells. This picture on the left again shows you a size comparison. This is a eukaryotic cell with smaller prokaryotic cells. And then in this diagram, you can simply visualize that the prokaryotic cell on the left has a lot less cell parts compared to the more advanced eukaryotic cell pictured on the right. We're focusing in this unit for the next couple of weeks on bacteria. Bacteria are organisms that have no nucleus, and we always think of them as being like really simple cells. But yeah, they're simple compared to a eukaryote, but they're really not that simple because they're alive, they're free-living organisms, and they've been on this planet for 3.5 billion years. Prokaryotes evolved before eukaryotes, so we can think of them as simple, but in reality they are doing something right because they've been here longer than any eukaryotic organism. You should have watched the Bonnie Bassler clip before watching these notes, and in the Bonnie Bassler TED Talk, she talks about how we think of ourselves as humans, but in reality I have more cells inside me that are bacteria cells than I have cells that are human cells. So over here on the right, there's a little comparison. I'm made of about 1 trillion human cells, but 10 times as many bacterial cells. Anywhere you look inside my body, you can find bacteria cells. Bacteria cells help you and I do our daily functions. We are made of so many bacteria cells, and without them, we would not function normally. In terms of the amount of DNA, similarly, we have human genes, but we are strongly influenced by the bacteria that's growing inside of us and what that bacteria is doing. So we are in this relationship with all these bacteria cells that we are carrying around. Those bacteria cells inside your body are called your microbiome. Biome meaning it's like a group of living things in the same place, all living together, and micro meaning we're talking about the small bacteria cells inside of you. So you've got this microbiome, and it influences a lot of what occurs inside your body. Over here on the left, there's a diagram of a fit person versus an obese person. And the pie chart just shows a little visual of the diversity of bacteria cells that are living inside a more lean person versus a more obese person. And that's due to the variety of foods eaten. Generally, people who are leaner, and this is a total generalization, but generally people who are leaner eat a bigger variety of foods. So the big variety of foods then feeds a diverse group of bacteria that live inside of them. Whereas people who tend to be overweight or obese eat more of the same types of food. Again, that's a generalization. But they eat more of the same types of food, so they're only feeding certain species of bacteria, and those are then the bacteria species that are inside of them. So people who tend to be healthier have a more diverse set of microorganisms living inside of them. We also heard a little bit about the microbiome when we were talking about antibiotic resistance, and the idea that in your colon, the end of your large intestine, where essentially your poop is stored, you can get a really bad infection by C. diff bacteria, and it's antibiotic resistant. And this is a huge problem in nursing homes and elderly people, where typical drugs and medicines will not treat that bacterial infection, causing excessive diarrhea and a whole host of other problems that then come with dehydration from excessive diarrhea. So scientists have found that through doing a poop transplant, you can take the poop of a healthy person, put it in the colon of an infected person with the C. diff bacterial infection, and the healthy bacteria from the poop will outcompete the dangerous bacteria. So again, you're trying to replace that microbiome. So the bacteria living inside the infected person are bad and pathogenic, so we can replace them with beneficial bacteria. Also, here's my little Kelsey baby, but she's pictured here because there have been several studies done that show that children who grow up in a home with pets tend to be healthier than children who grow up in homes without pets, because pets, of course, carry their own microbiome, carry their own bacteria around, and by being in close contact with animals, children pick up some of that bacteria. Their immune system gets used to it and acknowledges and knows that it's there. So children who grow up in homes with pets tend to have fewer allergies and fewer autoimmune diseases than children who grow up in what seems to be like a more sterile environment. Now, in the past 10-ish years, where there have been a lot of children who play video games or play on their phone at a very young age, as opposed to like going outside or even like watching movies, but as opposed to playing outside, that scientists are predicting that future generations may have even more health problems because, again, children are not being exposed to bacteria as much from a young age, so they can't build up that like strong immune system. In the Bonnie Bassler talk, she also talks about bacterial communication. We are going to focus on that a lot next week, the idea that bacteria talk to each other. One single bacteria cell is so tiny that it can't even hardly do anything. But if bacteria can talk to each other and know that they're in a crowd, then they can all act together. I kind of think of this like mob mentality. You might know some fellow high school students who, when they're alone, act a certain way, but then if they're in a certain group of people, they totally change their behavior and act differently. So the idea that when a bacteria cell is alone, they act one way, but knowing that they're in a crowd of fellow bacteria cells, they can then change their behavior to do something different. She gave this example of bacteria that bioluminesces, meaning it glows and lights up. And when the bacteria cell is all alone, it does not fluoresce. It does not bioluminesce. It secretes a molecule and tries to figure out, hey, like, is anybody else around or what's going on? And if nobody else is around, it's not going to spend energy to bioluminesce. But once that cell realizes that it's in company of other bacteria cells, it can sense that there's a whole lot more of this little signal molecule around, So then with like the snap of a finger, it can flick on a gene to create the protein that causes it to bioluminesce. So this is kind of a detailed example, but focus on the big picture. The big picture is that when the cell is alone, it doesn't do a particular thing. When the cell is with its friends, with its mob, with its group, then suddenly it changes its behavior and acts differently. This one example is just one example. There's many, many others. We call this quorum sensing. It's bacteria talking to each other. Bacteria use the little tiny molecules as a way to communicate. So they produce that molecule, release it into the environment, and then they can tell based on a receptor. We'll get more into proteins and receptors in a few weeks. But the cell can then identify if that molecule is present and how much of that molecule is present. So they will do specific behaviors only when they reach a certain population. The same is true for a lot of bacteria that cause disease. If I get infected with a particular bacteria strain, it wouldn't make sense for the bacteria to immediately start a full-on launch against my body, because with only a few bacteria infected inside of me, my immune system is going to kill that bacteria so fast. So instead, it would be beneficial for the bacteria to wait and kind of lurk in the shadows and reproduce a little bit and kind of get amped up in population. And then once there's enough of that bacteria, then that bacteria all launch an attack together, and then it's less likely that my immune system will be able to quickly eradicate it. Also, we'll learn a lot of details about the immune system second semester, but different species of bacteria have different shapes on the outside of their cells. So I'm drawing these as if they have a little circle on the outside of their cell membrane. My immune system identifies, oh shoot, these little circles, they don't belong. So they start to make proteins that can target those little circles. And then cells will come along and kill any cell that has a little circle on it. Well, some bacteria are super, super tricky, and maybe they'll, for a few days, have a little circle on the outside of their membrane, and the immune system will think, okay, these circles, they don't belong. Let's start killing everything that has a circle. And then these bacteria, again, will flick on a gene all at once and say, hey, we got to change the shape. We are not going to have little circles on the outside anymore. We're going to change our little shape to a triangle. So they're going to produce a new protein that changes all the shapes on the outside of their cell. Meanwhile, your immune system is thinking, I better kill everybody with a circle. Oh, but these guys don't have circles anymore. So they can then evade the immune system even more. Again, this is kind of a detailed example. We'll talk more about the details of it in the immune system unit, but just focus on the big picture. The big picture is when you have a few bacteria cells, they behave one way. When they get into massive numbers, they can change their behavior. To kind of conclude here a little bit about bacterial reproduction, we also saw these same ideas back when we were doing antibiotic resistance. But bacteria, we think of them as being asexual. However, they don't always just create a perfect clone of themselves. The asexual reproduction is called binary fission. Bi means two. Fission means to split. So essentially you have one cell, it photocopies its DNA, and then it splits into two separate cells. Binary fission occurs fast. About every 20 minutes a bacterial cell can reproduce. Conjugation, though, is the other half of the story. Bacteria are not 100% asexual. They can trade pieces of DNA with their neighbor. That's shown in this picture here. We've got a bacteria cell here. It has created essentially a tunnel through which it can shoot a piece of DNA, and then the other bacteria cell would obtain that new DNA. So bacteria are not truly asexual due to conjugation. They can trade pieces of DNA. The reason this relates to antibiotic resistance is because that antibiotic resistant gene is often traded in a population. To refresh your memory on antibiotic resistance, that mutation, that gene for survival, had to exist before the drug was put on the bacteria. The drug does not cause the bacteria to think, oh crud, I better switch my DNA. No, that variation had to occur first. Then only susceptible bacteria die off, and we are left with fully resistant bacteria who then reproduce. Those bacteria can share their DNA with other bacteria who are not resistant, thus creating an entire population of resistant bacteria. I would like to add that we should never be using the words strong and weak when we talk about antibiotic resistance, because resistance is generally to one specific drug. So here I applied this drug and only this bacteria here survived. If I had applied a different drug, it is possible that they all would have died. So we never say that a bacteria is strong. It is resistant to that one particular drug. Usually, a different drug would kill it because the gene only works to provide resistance for that one drug. So just be careful in your writing and never use the words strong and weak bacteria, because that's not correct. All right, to kind of wrap up, so a plasmid is what that gene is located on. A plasmid is a small piece of DNA inside bacteria cells. It has only a few genes on it, so usually genes required for normal survival, normal breakdown of food, normal photocopying of the DNA and splitting, that would all be located on a chromosome. A plasmid just has a few special genes. And then also humans can easily insert and change what DNA is inside a bacteria cell by using a plasmid. For example, if we were in class growing bacteria cells, every bacteria species that we grow would have a gene to survive a particular antibiotic. That way, I could make a plate for you. On that plate, I would put food, and I would put an antibiotic on that plate, and then I would put my bacteria cell that I have specifically designed to be antibiotic resistant. That way, I know growing on this plate here is only the bacteria that I want you to deal with. Anything that came out of my nose, came out of my mouth, came off the table, anything that randomly landed on there would probably not be resistant. And so that way I can create safe plates for you to use without the risk of you getting sick from any microbes that accidentally landed on there. All right, so that is chapter 16, an intro to bacteria. We'll continue to hear about bacteria throughout the school year, but for now, focus on quorum sensing and what it means for bacteria to talk to each other.